Christopher Ahlberg, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Recorded Future. My background is a data analysis guy. I've done a lot of work in intelligence, in sort of how to deal with, we'll just call it intelligence data. But then today we're going to apply that to information security. And you're going to sort of see me talk from all the way from Chinese policy down to their national vulnerability database, not much as the US vulnerability database. And we're going to try to look at how we can actually sort of couple together pretty hardcore, not mathematical analysis, pretty simple analysis, but it's still sort of good old data analysis all the way to policy. And maybe even if we can affect policy through those sort of things. The title is The Infinite Loop of Information Security in China. We'll come back and talk about with that. But maybe most excitingly for us is how we basically were able to bust the MSS's role in information control in China from afar. So that's what we're going to dive into. There'll be sort of 4 or 5 parts to this, depending on how we count. We're going to oh, yeah, that looks pretty light there, but hopefully that works. We're going to first talk about APT3, which many of you might have heard of, one of these threat actors, numbered threat actors, and we're going to sort of try to link how APT3 is the MSS. Then we're going to talk, sort of take a step back and talk about the MSS and how they fit into the Chinese cybersecurity law. I'm sure a few of you guys here have dealt with the Gdp Are coming out of Europe. That it is painful, but it is nothing compared to the Chinese cybersecurity law that is coming along at the same time, and maybe that will start to affect a few of you. Then we'll talk about specifically regarding what they call their national vulnerability database that plays a big role in the, or somewhat big role in this, and how the MSS uses that. Then we'll talk about how we believe that we, or not only at this stage, but how they outsmarted themselves, and then maybe we actually did make them clean up things at the very end. So that's a little finding at the end here that just came out 2 days ago. First time we'll talk about that will be here, so that should be pretty good. We'll take questions at the end. If there's something you really, given the small audience, if there's anything you really want to ask for, that's okay too. So you can ask pretty much anything you want. So I don't know, MSS, how many of you were familiar with them before? Yeah, a few, yeah. So that's the Ministry of State Security in China. The logo looks like what you expect it to look like, doesn't it? You can find it on the internet. So people who are into this sort of stuff tends to say the MSS is like the CIA of China, but that's not really right. It's actually much more call it the MI5 if you use, because the FBI in the US becomes a tricky comparable given that it's also largely a crime oriented organization. So if you do the English MI5, MI6 sort of comparison, MSS is much more domestically focused, and that will make sense as we sort of get into this talk here. They certainly have remit to go outside China if necessary. You can go to the MSS Wikipedia page and find some ungodly numbers that might scare you about how many MSS people there are supposed to be even in the US, or informants or agents or whatever you want to talk about it. Whether those numbers are right or wrong doesn't really matter for this talk. But ultimately, the MSS job is to control the Chinese people to maintain the power of the Chinese Communist, that's spelled wrong there. Oh, there we go. Communist Party. So, that's good background. Now, as we dive into this, many times when we sort of think about information security talks or information security research, it tends to be in the world, and again, unfortunately here, it sort of looks very light here, basically a picture of lots of indicators. and if we think about lots of information security research, I had a little debate with one of my colleagues here last night, that it tends to be like, here's a malware sample, here's a bunch of IPs, here's a bunch of domains, and no so what. And I think the point that we want to try to do here today is to have more of the so what in it, and not just because of, that's interesting from a research point of view, but maybe equally importantly, from a point of view of thinking about how you can actually put this to work. So I like to think about a chain that, if you think about one of these threat actors, and it doesn't really matter if it's a criminal or a state actor, but it's easier to think about it in the terms of a state actor. So here we have the MSS. They don't do things just for the hell of it. They do things because they're told. Doesn't matter if they work for the, a U.S. intelligence agency, a British one, an Israeli one, a Russian one, a Chinese one. They might have some people who are sometimes doing things they're not supposed to do or whatever, but largely they do things, because they're being told to. I was a soldier a long time ago. You do things because you're told. You might have a remit that is more or less free and so on, but ultimately you do it because of public policy. So when Xi Jinping comes up with a new policy, for example, around the Chinese cybersecurity law, that will have an impact on what, for example, MSS does, which will mean that they start tasking actors. Those actors could be inside their own building, or they could be down the street, as we've sort of seen a lot of, over the, people that they have used for rent, or in one way or the other. And again, we've seen that, it doesn't matter what country that is. And then eventually they'll go out a target, and now we'll see, taking advantage of vulnerabilities or particular tool sets that might leave indicators behind. And I think this sort of chain, tying things together, is where it gets pretty exciting, because now we can, if we're somebody who's on the defensive side of things, we could maybe start tying and understanding, like, here's a couple of indicators. Whoa, that's interesting. They actually tie back to this tool set. That could tell me something about who the actor is, and maybe I can start understanding, why is this actor interested in me? Have I gotten in the way of some policy, or am I sort of at a target for a reason here? Now, it's not easy to tie it all together, but I think being able to do the connective sort of tissue behind all of this is what we really should do in the information security community. So this is sort of something we're really trying to take on at Recorded Future, and I hope more people are going to try to do. Now, is it going to be like you always say, found IP address back to one single statement coming out of a Chinese president? No. Of course not. That's not that easy. There's no easy button in this stuff. So I'm not saying there is, just for full clarity. But that chain, very important to this. So today, the sort of the threat actor here that we'll talk about is this APT3. Lots of stuff around that one out there. You can sort of just type in APT3 and in Google, and you'll land either on apartment number 3 or the threat actor. You may need to put the word cyber somewhere in there or something, but you'll find all kinds of interesting stuff. And there'd been a lot of good research done on APT3, but nobody had ever really tied them together where they fit into the picture of Chinese government before. And again, here is the Recorded Future actor card on that. You can't see that, but you can imagine it behind the slide here. So the first thing we're going to try to do is to see if we can actually lay out who these guys are. So we've been working on that. This was about a year ago when we first published a set of research around this, and it ended up happening that we did this at very much exactly at the same time as this odd English blog called Intrusion Truth. It's worth looking up. intrusiontruth.com, org, whatever. And we believe it's British. You'll see from some wordings and this and that. So it was probably some government outfit in the UK who wanted to sort of push out something at the same time as we were doing this. We sort of, so this APT3, they use various sort of tool sets. One is a piece of malware called PRP. We found in PRP, and again, unfortunately here, depending on the I don't know if there's anything that we can adjust here, but probably not. In PRP, we find a set of domain registrations, and where we find domains used that has been registered by a couple of officials from a company called Guangzhou Boy Information Tech, which goes under the name BoySec. So this little company, BoySec, ends up being very interesting here. BoySec has a joint lab together with what's called Guangdong IT Sec, which is an organization in Guangdong. In Guangdong Sec in itself has a straight-up connection to something called CINITSEC, I'll just say the short version, which is long established to be part of the MSS. So what's sort of interesting here is we find this sort of straight connection here, somewhat quickly laid out, from this APT3 malware called PRP to this actor APT3, but then we make it more clear to be BoySec. which is then vis-a-vis, this joint lab that they run, is Sinitsec, which is part of, Guangdong IT-Sec to Sinitsec, which then established be part of the MSS. So now we can sort of find a straight-up connection here where MSS is running a threat actor, and we find what the malware is. Now, oh, you're switching. Oh, there we go. Now that in itself is not such a big deal because, if you had a threat actor in the US, a threat actor in Sweden, I'm Swedish by background, or, whatever country, running a company or using a contractor to run, cyber operations, it's like, of course they do. That's sort of makes sense, doesn't it? But it gets interesting when we're going to see what else. Oh, that's much better. Oh, there we go. Suddenly you don't need to take my word for it. So, oh, wow. Yeah. Oh. I get seasick from looking at that, so. Oh. Oh, wow. So now you can actually see that there was a domain here and stuff. So anyway, and the interesting thing is that the registrant of the domain, we're going to come back to this guy. You can't see that here, but so what it turns out that 6 months after we published this research, this company, Boysec, ended up being indicted by the US government, and so which we have here. So the Department of Justice, US charges 3 Chinese hackers who work for an information security firm for hacking 3 corporations, and then this guy Dong Wo, and then 2 other, that was the guy who was on the domain registration. And so that was pretty neat when you do information, do research, and then 6 months later. Now, in reality, it was not, we don't believe that we originated the core piece here, but we ended up being nicely used for what I would call parallel construction. So when the US then 3 months later put out this big thing on Chinese trade policies and sort of basically about intellectual property theft, this piece here, our group here, INSIC group, Record Future Research concludes, blah, blah, blah. And then there are many Republic reports linking Boysec to, and we ended up being, in this case, I guess that was, I've been using this footnote number 972. So when your work becomes footnote 972, you're like, all right, that's interesting. But it's not bad because it means that, again, now you could have sort of whether it's right or wrong to indict hackers on the other side of the planet, that's a separate sort of piece, or whether it's smart or not or meaningful. But that aside, it's pretty cool when your research ends up being sort of part of something like that. But again, maybe the point I'm asking you to sort of keep with you up until this point is like, so we've established here that we have a Chinese intelligence agency, mostly domestically focused, that through multiple layers ends up with this company, Boysec, that has been doing active campaigns around the world. But at the same time, it's very fair for you to say, is like, of course they do. And the same thing happens in Iran or Sweden or Holland or the US for that sake, the military-industrial complex in the US. It doesn't really matter. It happens everywhere. But it will be interesting, though, because where it does become interesting is because MSS here have other tasking that is vastly different from this. And that's the part that gets interesting. So with that, I'm going to switch into sort of a little bit more of the legal aspects of this, if you want. So I don't know, how many here have had to deal with GDPR in any way? Yeah, a few people. Yeah, no, it's painful here. We're coming up on GDPR Day. What is it? May. Yeah, we've got 6 days to go.
Did you mean to say a celebration of the freedom of Europeans instead of that?
Something like that, like same painful. But the interesting thing is, and this is painful by all means for anybody who've had to touch, and you just go like, what? But it's when you start comparing this to the Chinese information security law, it gets really interesting. So the MSS, which again is this sort of primarily domestically oriented organization, they have what you would basically say broad authority over technology and systems in China to be able to control information flow in the country. And this sort of, the piece that we're going to maybe focus in mostly today is from this MSS here running this organization that I mentioned, Sinitsec. They also run what I would call the CNMVD, so the Chinese National Vulnerability Database. So that's the equivalent of the US National Vulnerability Database. Now the US one, as you know, is run by NIST. Now it's not uncomplicated because in the US we have a vulnerabilities equities process, and we'll come back maybe and talk about that too. But ultimately, the US one is sort of run by NIST, which is somewhat what do we want to call it? Nice organization. But here we find CNMVD being run right up to these probably not so nice guys. And you start thinking about it, if these guys are doing offensive cyber at the same time as running this, that can get complicated. And maybe that it can get complicated will be the sort of the essence of this talk here as I sort of walk through this. So use that as a starting point, but now let's just compare a little bit notes on GDPR and the Chinese law. So GDPR, there's a bunch of different points. There's more of strengthened conditions for user consent. I'm sure you guys have been getting emails like, I'm sure you want to stay on this email list. Over the last, you must have all gotten those over the last couple of days here. Breach notification within 72 hours. It was like, oh shit, that's, and even if, is that really smart? Because you may want to, you may end up saying things in 72 hours that you don't really want to say, not to protect yourself, but towards your relationship with the bad guy. Right to be forgotten. Like many companies, they're not going to even be able to do that. But regardless, ultimately though, this is sort of, at least with good intent, I think is sort of how I would look upon it. Now, I am Swedish by background, so maybe I give them more leeway in that, but I think it's ultimately with good intent. They want privacy for people, and I think we've sort of seen over the last couple of years here with our dear internet that there are some privacy concerns that are pretty rightful. So, if you compare this to the Chinese law, it basically established the state's access to any and all data. So as soon as anything is sort of critical infrastructure, and their definition of critical infrastructure is vastly more liberal, if you want, or open than what it is in the US, and it says that the country, if anything, if somebody's a network operator or a critical information infrastructure, that means that it's pretty much everything, then CINITSEC can get to anything that is in those systems. So I have a friend who is the CIO of a company in Shanghai, and he ends up being just, his systems are pretty much wide open to the government. Even if he sort of puts all kinds of, controls on it, if the government shows up, he needs to open up all of them. It's pretty crazy. And where it gets maybe then real trick is that if there is a vulnerability that is discovered on a system and you fall into these categories, that vulnerability has to be reported to the CNMVD. So now you sort of have to give it straight up to the government, and that ends up being real tricky too. So you don't have, it's not sort of an opportunity, it's not something you can do, you have to do. So now this ends up being, if you're work for a multinational, I'm sure a few of you here worked for companies that are sort of doing business around the world, this ends up being real tricky. Because basically, you end up in this sort of, if you are doing business in China, I don't know, a big oil company or a big bank, maybe it might be the most logical, you're doing business in China, you're doing business in Europe, and the European law says that you have to do all these protective things around being able to sort of protect user records. And then you have the Chinese law that says that the government has to be able to see everything. They're two things. They just don't really compute, I think is sort of what we're trying to say with fancy words here. It doesn't compute. So I think we're going to find a lot of interesting sort of literally Chinese walling that has going to be done around the Chinese side of things here that might actually drive good business for people in your profession to figure that out. So I would look at that as a consulting opportunity maybe. But real tricky. And we're already seeing, again, I don't want to, don't think about this as being sort of a ding on China here in any, because look, they're all, they've got to do their thing. But, clearly American companies have started to adopt to this. And I thought the most interesting things was that when Apple said that they would store their keys for iTunes and a few other things in China. And, that's obviously not what it's all about. It's more. There's more than that, and so this is happening, and it's going to be real interesting to see what that happens. Now, Okay, so take all of this, what I've talked about so far. We've basically said that the MSS exists. The MSS runs offensive cyber operations. Maybe not a big surprise, but they do. And then it is in the context of a law that requires everybody to sort of report, or everybody who is a network operator or a critical infrastructure to report their data into the CNMVD, or their vulnerabilities into CNMVD. That is the equivalent of their FP, we'll call it MI5. You know, like I think of it a little bit like taking my vulnerabilities and sending. It's a little bit like putting the fox in control of the hen house, sort of thing. If you mix up the intelligence agency and the vulnerability database here. Maybe I'll come back and talk about that again. Now, to be able to look at this, we're going to dive in and look at vulnerability databases, and I'm not going to be very nice to either one of them. We'll compare the U.S. and the Chinese one. Maybe I'll ultimately be a little bit nicer to the U.S. one. It's an interesting area because there's really only 4 national vulnerability databases in the world. There's the U.S. one, there's the Chinese one, there's a Japanese one that is actually at the same scale as the Chinese and the American one. And they pretty much have the same coverage of CVEs, each one of them. You can sort of line them up, and there's about 110,000 in each. Then there's a Russian one called FS Tech, which is different, and we have some cool research on that coming soon here too. But except for those 4, they're really, a country like France or a country like the UK don't have one. It's sort of a big undertaking. They all use the same identifiers, CVE identifiers, which provides really nice opportunity when you want to compare them. That's sort of a cool thing about it. So one of the things that we started doing, we've sort of been very interested in trying to track vulnerabilities at large at Recorded Future for a long time. And the thing that we like about it is that we can take a CVE and we can try to find what does the open source know about it, you know, like what is an information security researcher publishing about it. He might put out something on Twitter. It might be somebody in the dark web, you know, like in some exploit.in or Maza or whatever sort of forum where somebody's saying, look, I'm trying to exploit this vulnerability, or I'm selling an exploit kit that takes advantage of it. So we've been trying to organize that type of data for a long time. And we've also tried to use it for benchmarking to see, for example, how fast is the US National Vulnerability Database compared to the web. And one of the things that we sort of found out early on here was that if you just sort of use a 0 point t equals 0, and sometimes t equals 0 can be tricky here, but from when a vulnerability gets spilled one way or the other outside the building of a company, as it might be published in a news article, on a tweet, or like really anything, anywhere. If you assume that's t equals 0, turns out that it takes the US government 33 days to publish something from the MVD. It's a long time. You know, at least in my book, it's sort of a long time. And we sort of published that study, that was probably even a year and a half ago. And you know, but the hard part was to figure out, like, was that slow or fast? We didn't really know. It felt slow, you know, because that's 33 days for all kinds of bad things to happen. But we're like, how can we benchmark this? And that's when it sort of got us into this, let's compare it to the Chinese vulnerability database. And it turns out that in China, when we did this first, and this was in November 2017, and you're going to see me now doing, and this is going to be slightly tricky, using 3 different time points in November and in March, February, March, and then nowish, like 2 days ago, measurement time points here. But this is from November 17, the US doing this, so the US MVD doing in 33 days, but the Chinese at that time was doing it in 13 days. So we wrote up that report. It was pretty simple, like this is what they're averaging at, this is what the US is averaging at. We send that to as high of secure InfoSec professionals there are in the country, so the White House, and got a very cool email back, I'll make some calls. And so we'll come back and look at that. But actually, it was taken quite seriously. So that was cool, and we had great interactions with the people at the NKIC about that. And, because, many times you do research or publish and, people frankly don't really care, obviously, or, it's from that. Or they won't tell you if they care or not. But we got really nice feedback where, I think it was one of those where it's sort of like, well, that was painful, but okay, let's try to figure out. So nice, maybe not the right word, but all right. So by the way, this is the screenshot from the Chinese vulnerability database. The US one is good in the sense that it has a pretty open API, you can scrape it, you can do all kinds of things with it. The Chinese one is tricky because it basically has all kinds of non-scraping stuff on it. So if you too aggressively try to go visit it, they'll boot you out in a heartbeat. So we had to use we have sort of at Record Future when we harvest for data, we got one approach that we do for New York Times or BBC or something, and we knock on the door, like, look at robot.txt, try to be a good sort of whatever, netizen or whatever you want to call it. If we go to a dark website or something like that, then it's a very different infrastructure that comes at it that tries to be something else, and depending on what it is, we'll do all kinds of different weird stuff. And the weird stuff had to be applied here, because otherwise it just didn't work.
Was this list on the dark web, or were you on the dark web using?
I'm just saying that we have sort of a set of techniques for doing that. You know, like, and we ended up using similar technique because otherwise, because we're going to get to, if nothing else, 110,000 web pages, and they'll try to stop you, and if you throttle you in all kinds of different ways. So it's
Legal techniques, or?
I don't know whatever they are, legal, or if what we were doing legal, yeah, no, so absolutely, so yeah, no backing into URLs as we were talking about or anything of that sort. So yeah, no, all legal. We have a very nice lawyer at our company, so it's a constant battle, but it's good. It's good. If you're going to build, it's a good point. If you're going to build a threat intel company of size, it has to be legal. That's just that simple. So the other part is that it's all Chinese. So we use a lot of our Chinese natural language processing techniques to get to the actual words and all of this sort of stuff. So then, just a little bit further on this, as I said, 13 days versus 33 days. At that point in time, it was actually pretty interesting. There was about 17 or 1,800 CVEs that was in the CNMVD, but it just wasn't in the US MVD because they had this big backlog that they haven't processed. And we could do this sort of, it's nerdy, but sort of cool. So again, T equals 0, and you look at, what percentage of vulnerabilities that have been included in the database out from that T equals 0, and you can see how the Chinese just have a higher processing speed and the MVD being behind.
Were those missing CVEs from a particular time frame, like explainable by like older stuff that CNVD had already ingested, or is it?
It was ongoing, but ongoing. We'll come back and talk about that actually. So.
How do you use the mapping to compare one CD from one database to another? How do you
They use the same identifiers.
Oh, they use the same
Yes. Sometimes in life you're lucky. So and the Russian used the same, and the Japanese used the ones same identifiers. There's trickiness to it, but same identifier. And it turns so you look at something like Dirty Cow, published on the web. 2 days later, the Chinese had a report on it. 20 days later, the MVD did. Or even something like Apache Struts, T equals 0, published. Chinese got a report out the same day. Took the US MVD 3 days.
Do the different databases analyze each other, the Chinese and the US one?
Say if they.
Like if the Chinese has one that the US doesn't, will the US look in that database and say, okay?
I think part of the problem is that the US one, and I don't know this for a fact, but I think we've established that the Chinese are looking at the web at large for collecting data. The US one looks at only the company's submissions in their own research. So that's sort of that is actually the underlying reason why, and they may be changing that. So, all right, I'm just going to watch time a little bit here. So now, this is where it then gets really interesting. So, and it's sort of one of these beautiful times in data analysis where here you have the Chinese being very fast, and then the U.S. sort of being slowish, but then sometimes the Chinese was very slow. Does that make sense? That they sometimes just basically sat on these vulnerabilities. And so they would, with vulnerabilities with known exploits, the MVD was faster than the CNMVD 85% of the time, completely flipped. And so basically, if it's a higher threat vulnerability, you could also look at CVSS scores, for example, and say things with a high CVSS score, which ultimately had a high CVSS score, they'd also just take much longer. So we found some individual ones, for example, this 2017 199, actually being actively exploited by a Chinese actor. And while it was in this publication lag, in China. So they're holding back on it, and it's being used actively to exploit. It's sort of really neat. And it actually turns out that this building, which is where the MVD is, and I think it's on this 3rd floor, is also where this group Cinetech is in. So it's like literally in the same building. They literally have the same phone numbers on the, and I think we established something about the sign here too. So it's like, it's right there. And so I think in Intel terms, this means that they got a formal vulnerability evaluation process, which is it's sort of equivalent to the US vulnerabilities equities process. But remember that the US vulnerabilities equities process is based on research that the US government has done and then chooses to put out. These are vulnerabilities that exist outside China or are sort of being published, and then the Chinese chooses to hold tight for themselves. And you sort of might say, like, why would they do that? Like,
How do the Chinese validate the exploits? Because I assume that's part of the lag with the US is that there's some level of validation.
so I think they're validating it, but given that this is where it has, because I kept saying so many times that MSS is domestically focused. So through their database, they're actually controlling how systems are being upgraded inside China and in their near region. And so by holding back on this information, they're basically making sure that their vulnerabilities are open doors in their local region. So now, here's this 2017-1919. This is a record future time chart or timeline here. MVD publishes, in this case, pretty fast, and then more or less a year comes along before CNMVD publishes it, and by that time, first Chinese guys have taken advantage of it, and then later other actors also. So sort of that time lag is right there. Another nice example was this Shanghai AddUps, which actually in that case came out first in New York Times. This was a neat situation because, or neat, I don't know, but a backdoor in Android that via sort of a local Chinese company, I think, where sort of, that was doing middleware for certain Android phones. And so again, the Chinese held back on publishing that locally for about a year. And so in that time frame, this being actively exploited in Hong Kong and other sort of areas. So, going at local activists, local, whatever. And now, interesting that the New York Times would beat both of them. You're like, can't we fix that? that should be sort of another sort of problem. Now, so that was sort of interesting in itself, I think. And it's a little bit nerdy, but I think it's because you really are observing a state actor. And I think it's neat in the sense that traditionally we've observed state actors by looking at their malware. This time, we're able to look a little bit more upstream by looking at what vulnerabilities they're holding back on. So it's sort of, you're finding their targeting process, which is really what you want to get under the skin of. So then, 6 months later, or 5.5 months later, from when we sort of put this out, this is where this was crazy to me. So a guy that I have a lot of respect for, that I'm sure you guys know, Dan Geer. He's the CISO of In-Q-Tel, but it's sort of like obviously incredibly well known in this community. And he made a comment to me many years ago. He said, look, information security is sort of unique in its sense that you're dealing with a sentient opponent which might fiddle with the data you're trying to measure. I'm like, that sounds cool, theoretical, and so on, but actually this is going to turn into one of these cases. So we published this report in 2017, and it turns out that pretty much right afterwards, they go back and backdate or post-dates 99.6% of the data that we had called out. And so this is where, because, and you think about, like, does your government listen to you or not? And you never really know. And I said that we were excited because we had the US government sort of engaging with us here. But we had no idea whether, we looked if the URL was being blocked in Baidu, and we thought it was for a second, but it wasn't. But no, so eventually we found that. So I'll sort of take you through that here. So the first thing we did, so we published this in March of 2018. This was at SAS. And one of the first things was that the US MVD actually was now doing in 27 days what had earlier been 33, so that was nice. We sent that to the government guys, and they were like, oh, way to go. So that was exciting. The Chinese was pretty much the same, 13 to 12 days. And the MVD was sort of munching into the backlog and working through basically both through doing faster, but also seemingly going back through some of the history and catching up. But maybe this is the sort of the real juice here, that we found that, and literally the first version of this slide before we really got it was that we were saying that they didn't listen. But then we sort of started diving into the data, and as our chief data scientist said, starting reading records. He's always like, do not trust, sort of, it's funny, a statistician who says, don't trust averages, don't trust sort of like the simple answer, start reading database records. And we started reading database records, and we're like, what the heck happened here? Something is weird. Why are all these states changed? The data sets don't line up anymore. And so we had originally, and this is going to get slightly complicated, they had originally published or held back, or we had detected 267 or 268 vulnerabilities that they'd held back on. Then by the time this research came out, that had grown to 343, but it's that same sort of idea of an outlier. And then we noticed that they had actually, for exactly those 267, plus these new ones, and only those, out of 110,000, they had backdated those to make it look like they were always ahead of the US government. And you know, it's sort of just crazy. And the part that sort of blew us away was that we had really only published the identifiers of 2 or 3, those, the Shanghai AddUps one and this Microsoft one. But the other ones, we had just sort of shown how you could understand which were basically a methodology, but we hadn't given them a list. So that was just crazy. They must have put serious number of people on making sure that they landed on exactly that list. So non-trivial sort of task to do. And so they fiddled right out, straight up with that. And I'm going to show you, we actually have the data set for this for download. I'll show the URL, and where, you know, if you want to sort of compare what we've done here, or it's all there. The raw data will be there. So they used our methodology to identify and backdate those exact vulnerabilities. And you could argue why. They might be that they feel like somebody was going to start yelling at them domestically, that they are messing up their mission. We think that it's actually more importantly that it was this height evidence of a vulnerability assessment process, and you know, make sure that this ability to detect the vulnerabilities would not be there. Here is sort of a good example of what it looks like. So here's this 2017-0199, you know, to 2017-06-07. And then post the change, they changed it. 2 months, boom. And so and the crazy part was that we had then, we hadn't really kept screenshots for all of these. We'd sort of kept the raw HTML, but not the screenshots. Stupid us. And it's blocked in Wayback Machine, of course. You know, so you can't. So there's no copy of it. But we had a few, and so it was just nice for when you publish a report to be able to show the actual sort of screenshots. So I think this is really interesting in the sense that you sort of have an intelligence agency that is now mixing, that is doing two. Yeah, it's really, you're trying to have an intelligence agency do 2 things. They're doing targeting, and obviously then once they found their target and you know, they're tasking and then going out and exploiting that and so on. And at the same time, you're trying to have them do some public good. So, you know, trying to do an information security mission. And that is just really, really hard. So I've been using this, an intelligence mission together with the information security mission, and you will mess up here. This is sort of if I'm giving advice to intelligence agencies here, is that it's just insanely hard to stay clean here without messing up here. This is why we do, and in the West we like to say, you know, this is MI5, this is MI6, this idea of separating, or FBI versus CIA. There are many reasons we try to do these sort of separations between church and state, because, you know, you're going to do ugly things here. Because if you don't, you will sort of inadvertently, like, it's pretty much impossible not to, you know, disclose specific targeting, what families you're trying to targeting, or even worse here, the cadence of operations, which, you know, again, you know, we choose, and that was sort of an interesting thing as a company. We ended up with this sort of big discussion. Do we actually tell the world about this fiddling? Or do we shut up about it and just sort of observe the vulnerabilities, and, you know, being able to sort of keep publishing about the vulnerabilities? And we had advisors, or have advisors to the company, who come from the intelligence community. They're like, you're shutting up. Like, what the hell are you even thinking about here? You know, because if that's your business and background, that's what you're going to think about. I think our mission is to make, the most grandiose, it's one way or the other, try to make the internet better, and without overdoing our own sort of role in the world. But this is one of those where you can sort of maybe have a little bit of a systematic effect rather than just saying dinging one piece of malware, or dinging one piece of a process. So I think we sort of did the right thing with that. I think there are many things about this Chinese interaction, going back now to the stuff that I talked about before, that makes it really interesting. The law is run by MSS, and MSS runs threat actors. They run the vulnerability database. They cherry pick the vulnerability database, and again, you end up with this infinite loop here where you're just trying to. It's just really hard. And I think I'd love to be the fly on the wall in the room with the dear Chinese here, like how they discussed about this stuff and where that ended up being discussed. I'll have a better link for where the download is at the end of it. So without doing this guy, I won't beleaguer on this, but this is sort of the problem, if you want, about China is they're trying to create this open state in many ways. Like China has endorsed capitalism clearly already back in Deng Xiaoping's talk in '91 or whatever it was, but they've clearly done all of that, but then at the same time are trying to keep such tight control, being it sort of, you think about the Great Firewall, 50-cent army, all kinds of different things that I think they're actually fantastic research opportunities where you look at this sort of information control and then look at the stuff that disappears, or the stuff that was never there, that could have been there to begin with. There's all kinds of interesting things, and I'll come back and talk about that. But lots of opportunities. So then earlier this week we said, or maybe late last week, we said, let's just do a refresh on this and see where we are with our dear Chinese here. And so after we published this report in 2018, so just here in May, we did our latest refresh of the database. At least we can still get to it, so that's a good sign of our collection abilities, because you imagine that they would put up all kinds of stops to it. They actually have stopped creating these outliers. So at least in the way that
They've stopped manipulating backfill?
Yeah. Oh, they certainly did that, but they're also, the lags are gone. Like they're not sitting on them anymore. At least, and I think I have a bar chart on that here. So in basically here in March, there were 343 outliers, and there's still 343 outliers. It's exactly the same vulnerabilities that are sitting there. Now, do we know that they have, because of that, stopped doing this? No, they at least stopped doing this. Now, and has that made the CNMVD a better database? I think so, but do we know that whether somewhere deep in there, they still could be fiddling with that? Of course they could. Of course.
Changes in the amount that was being published to CNVD, like a velocity of the thing?
The same, the overall velocity is the same, but we're going to do more cuts at this data here and download the whole thing in various sort of ways and cutting it, and so I just wanted to make sure that when I came here today to be able to have sort of fresh data, I thought that'd be fun for you guys, and so that's what this is. We also then could see that again, to your point here, the U.S. has actually gone up slightly from 27 to 28 days, but I think that's statistically insignificant. The Chinese is sort of still at their 13 days. The U.S. is eating through their backlogs. So the velocity of these systems is still there. But the hard part here is that obviously seeing here that should be 1, 2, 3. Sorry about that. The analysis confirms no new outliers, but that's all we sort of really know. So who knows what they really did? So a couple of lessons and conclusions, and then I'll sort of wrap up from this. So from an intelligence agency point of view, and I'll really from there, intel agencies need to know that the web, they're all on the web in one way or the other. Even the Russian, the Chinese, and so on. It's very hard not to be on the web these days, and even for an intel agency. And that drives new observables. And I think that's sort of what this is. This is new observables that is interesting. Running overlapping intel and InfoSec programs is really difficult. The one to observe, for those who are interested in this, is in the UK. It's called NCSC, the National Cyber Security Center, I guess, which is a part of GCHQ. They're not sort of shy about it. It's part of the logo. It's all of that, and it's remarkably open on the web. You can literally follow the blog of even some of the internal people about their mistakes and this and that. One of them like blogging about how he got fished and so on. I bet you can sort of start observing this one in some interesting ways. I don't know. We'll see. And I think the lesson here for policymakers directing these guys, they got to think real carefully about how you sort of don't screw this up. And obviously, don't get caught here for the Intel agency. Now, for those of you who are not working over there, but who are on this side, I think the cool part with this, and it sort of struck me after we had worked on this, it goes back to this book. I don't know if anybody read this. It was called Top Secret America, book by, her name is Dana Priest, a woman at Washington Post. Really cool author. She's done a bunch of interesting books and studied the Intel. 5 minutes? 10 minutes. 10 minutes. She wrote a bunch of different books about the Intel community, and the one, Top Secret America, is interesting. Might be 12, 13 years old, and what she did was basically downloading job ads from all kinds of contractors, where they would put in code names and all kinds of different things in the job ads, and then she took all these job ads, put them on a big floor, and started grouping them together and saying, oh, there's a bunch of companies here working on this program. There's a bunch of people working on this program. And these things start to be connected in this way, and da-da-da. And so she basically was able to back into all kinds of things that people got deeply disturbed about and thought, like, why the hell did she, like, and then people got mad at her for publishing it. But, you know, who knows if that you could, fair enough, or whatever. But I think she did, what she proved out was that once you stop doing just human reading of materials and actually start doing machine analytics, you can start doing things. Now, she was doing it painfully by hand, but I think the sort of the era that we're at now is that we don't just sort of read, but we can actually start doing, and I'm not using the word machine learning here or AI or anything, I'm just saying count, maybe sum, maybe subtraction, very basic operations. But I think in the world here of LinkedIn and online hiring and operator social media activity and troll activity and all kinds of stuff for military industrial complex and certs and blocked and pulled hidden activity, you know, all of that stuff is there. And I think there's grandiose ways of using this for people who are on the defensive side of things. And even maybe China MSS can be affected through this. So I wanted to just say, look, the data is here. And if you go to the blog, you'll find it. If you look for blog, Record a Future blog and CNMVD, you're going to see this URL, so you can download it. In our system, we have USMVD and CNMVD and the Japanese one, the FSI, like all this stuff there, 800,000 other sources and this and that. So lots of data to be played with. Go to our website, you can check it out. We have our Cyber Daily you can get to for free. And that's it. So questions or comments?
Have you done any intercomparison between CNVD and FS Tech and things like that yet? Or is that?
So it's a great question. It's coming. It's coming. So we wanted to do, for example, we wanted to do the Japanese one, but because it would feel like it's regional sort of thing. I must say that we don't expect the Japanese to be fiddling with it. It just doesn't feel. But who knows? You know, like you never know.
The Japanese are super open about their certs. So
Yeah.
They publish a ton, like
Yeah.
even more than the NCS.
Yeah. No, so it's good. It's good. So that one is in the works, and this one is in the works. Now here we found devious stuff, but I will only say that it's devious stuff that we found, but it's different. It's quite different from, and I won't say anything more than that. And that will be coming over the next month or two here. So we got to do more work on it, and you know, whenever you dive into something like this, I do think that it's interesting because these things have multiple purposes. They have multiple taskings. They're run by different entities. So we want to make sure that we just don't put out the sort of the statistical fast or slow, but try to understand the context, and that's why it takes some work. So.
Do you have data around whether they actually store exploits in these as well as like a back end, so you have a mapping of the exploit?
That's we have done. We so interesting that you'd ask, because we've done work before, just sort of mapping up here the vulnerabilities that Russian threat actors are using, and then we've tried to map that to this. So that's part of what you'll see in that piece, for example. That's probably nice work to be done on that, on the Chinese one as well. So.
how long have you been looking at the trends of these data points?
So we started collecting on the US one, maybe, I don't know, 2013 or something. So we like munched at that. The CNMVD probably 3-4 years sort of thing, yeah.
When we did a change of administration, anything that you can comment on from post 2017?
Yeah. So without being political, like this is always tricky, never know. No, I get it. So it's been easier to speak to Rob Joyce than to the prior guy about this sort of stuff, I must say. So that's just, but ignore the politics of that. Clearly we've had an incredibly competent guy running that part, and so he's been very engaged in that. So that's been very cool. Nothing really in terms of, and then I guess recently these guys sped up when we were talking to them. But on the other hand, we didn't speak to them, or nobody put them on the spot like this 3 years ago. So maybe 3 years ago, so we've only done that once. I can't say anything systematic about that, I guess. But these are important missions. I think that's sort of the point. This is important stuff. And so that's why we were sort of excited about it, because it's, trying to make these guys do better.
Forgive my amateur question. I don't know, this is new to me, but can anyone go to those databases online and look at those?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This one is totally open. They have both an API, they got RSS feeds, they got all kinds of stuff. Completely open. You can download the whole data set.
Twitter bots that will retweet new ads to the USN one.
Yeah, it's well run. It's good. It's not perfect, but it's good. This one has a nice website, but again, if you try to be aggressively too on it, it's all in Chinese. Yeah. So we have Chinese linguists, we have all the sort of stuff and do all the sort of the collection around that. This one is 100% in Japanese, no English, and then likewise this one is in Russian as well, but they're supposed to be information security resources, to help their countries, at least. The one at the bottom we're a little bit dubious about, but we'll see. I don't want to say too much, but they're all open. You can just go there.
Can you comment about if a foreign company wants to establish a private VPN in China, you need to give a backdoor to China so they can see your links or something like that?
So it depends on so you said it for a company or a person.
Foreign company wants to have an office in China that needs to establish.
I think if you can, and I'm not the expert here, like a colleague is, but I think the simple answer is if your business is only doing business with expats, and I don't know if those who've been to Shanghai, it's like it's people from everywhere on the planet, seemingly. Shanghai is like, whatever, it's this crazy town. So if you're only doing business to them, I think you don't need to. But as soon as you do business with local Chinese nationals, you do. And so that's the tricky part. Now, if you run a laundromat or something, you don't need to give access either. But as soon as you fall into this pretty wide definition, you do.
Yeah, because China has been cracking down on public
Yeah.
VPNs. I don't know what happened to the private companies that require to link to their headquarters here in the US.
It's tricky from all kinds of different angles. So.
Curious, the MSS, you said it was run by the Communist Party, correct?
Mm-hmm.
About how transparent are they in China with their activities as far as like the things that you've mentioned that they do?
So I think how transparent.
Their mission statement's pretty clear.
Yeah, no, it's what's been interesting is observing is Tencent and Keyhoe. I'm sure I said that the wrong way. The white hat sort of community in China is there. There's been some of you probably have seen some of these points about that they're not being allowed anymore as much to go to Western conferences and present vulnerabilities. So there's some of this going on, but I think. So I don't have a great answer, but I think what will be very interesting is to see as they're driving an IT community and with these companies here to be able to get the sort of the benefit of the capitalistic aspects of that and also suppress certain parts of it. That may not be easy, and I think that might be a very interesting area to look at. Like what is Keyhoe or what are they called? Yeah, anyway, so 360. That what are they publishing and not? They're very interesting. So.
So aside from changing the date or backdating, have you seen any changes to like a CVSS score or other data about out the actual vulnerability?
That we didn't observe that, but that might be worth digging a double for. But I don't think we did. We didn't see anything of that. So.
I guess this would be speculation, but what do you think, in your opinion, their motivation was to backdate? Was it to show, hey, competition with the U.S., we're as good or better, or to hide the fact that we were working with vulnerabilities before vulnerability?
So I think the nicest way to think about it is that this is an agency that has tasking, to do information security in China. They were told by somebody to do something, and suddenly they look stupid by having done something ugly, and somebody dinged them and just clean it up, sort of thing. That's sort of the nicest way of thinking about it. The most nefarious, sort of evil way of thinking about it is that they literally were running this, the equivalent of a vulnerabilities equities process here, like a real, targeting process, and they needed to shut that down to make sure that they didn't impede or impact their ongoing operations. So whether that would probably be a little bit of panic, this might be a whole lot of panic, I don't know. Again, I would love to be in the room when that was discovered. So, all right, thank you very much, guys. No.